Well, we are finishing up our series on the life of David today. This is part 4, and we've been examining David's life, trying to find some ways in which his life applies to the way we live life today. I think we've been successful in that over the past couple weeks of just kind of digging out how God interacted with him and how he wasn't really the superhero of a guy, he was just a guy who was faithful. And how his faithfulness and obedience turned into all the great things that God did through him and all the hard things. We're going to talk about something really hard in David's life today. If it feels like you're coming in at the end and you have no idea what's going on, like the credits are playing at the movie and you just don't get it, have no fear. You can go to tcat.church/David. All the 3 previous messages are there, along with discussion questions and some other stuff that you can interact with to kind of feel like you've been a part of what we've been doing. Today, we're going to talk about a pretty common phenomenon that happens in everybody's lives, and we're going to take that common phenomenon and try to connect it to David's life, because I think his life perfectly illustrates something that happens to us all the time. David's life perfectly illustrates what happens when things don't go the way we thought they were going to go. Right, that we had a great plan and we had this great vision or this great dream of what we thought life was going to look like, and then somewhere along the way either we did something that kept that dream from happening or somebody else did something that's going to keep that dream from happening, but all of a sudden what we thought was going to happen isn't going to happen, and that's not something that's uncommon. That's common to the human condition. And some of these things are really hard, and I realize we're entering into a season, into Christmas in these next few weeks where and especially probably beginning with Thanksgiving, when it comes to family things, that just amplifies all of these unmet dreams or unmet expectations or unmet hopes that we might have had for ourselves. And so all of us are dealing with this, okay? So if you're sitting here this morning, you think this is just not, this is my condition and my thing I'm going through and nobody understands, I can assure you, rest assured, that you're sitting in a room full of people who understand that plans are great, but reality is greater. I'm a planner. I love to have a plan. I think it was Churchill that said, planning is absolutely essential, but plans are completely useless. And I paraphrase that a little bit, but I understand that in a lot of different ways because you know this. You have a dream, you have a hope, you have a vision for what your future is going to look like, and then all of a sudden that dream can't come true. It just can't. You find yourself in a place where that prodigal son, that prodigal daughter is probably not going to come home. You find yourself in a place where you're probably not going to get that dream job, or you got that dream job and it wasn't the dream job that you thought it was, that it's not turning out the way you had hoped, the way you had dreamed it was going to. You find yourself in a place where you realize that he's going to marry her anyway, or she's going to marry him anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. Or you find yourself in a place where you realize that second marriage is kind of starting to look like the first one all over again, and you didn't think it was, but here you are and you're stuck, where your dreams of what you thought the future could be just don't turn out that way. Now, depending on what kind of faith background you grew up in or what kind of church you grew up in, you find yourself kind of in this conundrum because all of a sudden you're like, God promised you, right? God promised you. And you feel like these promises that were coming your way, they're not being put into fruition. Like, God, wait a minute, you're not holding up your end of the deal. God owed you, right? That you went to church and you said all the right things and you did all the right things and you sang all the right songs and you showed up Sunday after Sunday. And then you look into other people's life and it just kind of looks like they're getting things and you're not. Or maybe worse, God granted them your wish. You see what you wanted fulfilled in somebody else's life. What are we supposed to do with that, right? And again, this is not an uncommon thing. The temptation for us is to feel these things. Like, God, you owed me. God, you promised me. You gave my wish to somebody else. This is not fair. How is this supposed to happen? But since it's so common to us, and since it's so illustrated so well in David's life, I thought we want to take a few minutes to talk about this. Because I feel like oftentimes when we find ourselves in this mode of thinking, we're really tempted to hit the eject button on our faith. Or to say there is no God. Like, either God's going to fulfill this answered prayer or God doesn't exist, right? Or if God doesn't do this, that means he doesn't like me very much. And we're all tempted to feel that. So what might be a better response? Or how have other people dealt with this in the past? What do we do when our dreams can't come true? When our dreams can't come true, whether it was our fault or somebody else's fault, when we had this vision, this dream, this hope for tomorrow, and it can't come true, what do we do? Again, I think David's life perfectly illustrates this. And I have to fast forward about 40 years of David's life in the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to encourage you to go back and read 1st and 2nd Samuel again. All of this is going to be found in your Bibles. But I'm going to start right after his coronation, which is where we ended last week. And I'm just going to give you a few thoughts of how David's life went from that way forward. Just fast forwarding so you understand the soap opera that David's life turned into. So here we go. Right after David's coronation, he becomes the king. And everybody knew he was going to be the king, and everybody was excited that David was the king. But just like God said, being king comes with these expectations. And one of those expectations is that the king gets to ask for whatever the king wants to ask for. The king gets it, period. And so what happened was David was king for several years. He's in his 50s now. He's not handsome, regal, rugged David. He's in his 50s. And 50s is a good age to be in now, but back then there was not much health care, and his teeth had all probably fallen out, and he didn't smell very well and all that kind of stuff, but he's king. And so one night, David is walking through his palace, and he looks out over the hillside, and he'd sent all of his troops out to battle. Nobody knows why he didn't go, but he's looking out over the window, and he sees one of his general's wives, let me say that again, one of his general's wives bathing. Everybody knows her name probably. Her name is Bathsheba. He sees Bathsheba. If you didn't know that, it's totally cool. You're going to find that out in a minute. But if you grew up in Sunday school like I did, most people know this person's name. Bathsheba's bathing. David is just like smitten with her. He looks at a servant and says, "Bring her to me," because he's a king. He can ask for whatever he wants. So Bathsheba comes and spends the night with him, probably spends a couple nights with him. The next thing you know, he gets that text message saying, "Hey, David, I'm pregnant." I made that text message part up, but you get the point. She finds out that she's pregnant. David goes, "Oh no, what am I going to do? I have to control this outcome." He panics, just like he did when he was young. And so he brings Uriah back. He tries to convince Uriah to go home so he can convince Uriah this is his baby. That doesn't work out. So finally he has Uriah killed. He has this Bathsheba's husband killed in battle. He tells all his generals to back up and let him be killed on the front lines of battle. That happens. David looks like this magnanimous, wonderful leader because now he's taken this pregnant widow into his home and marrying her, and everything's fine. He looks like the hero. He has controlled the outcome. The problem is, he lives in a palace, and in a palace, walls talk, and everybody knew what David had done. It was the worst kept secret of worst kept secrets. And so one day, a prophet named Nathan comes to visit with David, and he tells David a story, and he gets him riled up about this guy in the story, right? And how this guy had stolen something. Well, David gets so upset, and then Nathan looks at David and says, "You're the guy. You're the guy." In the King James, it says, "Thou art the man." And you can imagine what Bible nerds like me did when I was in seminary and found that out. But thou art the man. You're the guy in the story. You're the one who's made the mess of things. You're the one who's stolen from someone who was innocent. You're the one who's had an innocent man put to death. Don't you realize what you've done? So then David is like completely heartbroken. He comes to his senses. He admits what he's done wrong. He repents of that. But then God gives a word to David through Nathan. It says this is what the Lord says: "Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity on you." And boy, does he ever. You did what you did in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel. You tried to cover this whole thing up to make yourself look better. You tried to pretend like you didn't sin, but you actually did. This is a huge mess. Then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die." But this perfectly illustrates something that I say all the time, and I know this is an aside, but I don't want you to miss this. See, every sin you commit, every sin I commit, every sin that's committed in the world comes prepackaged with its own consequence. Don't miss that. Okay, and in this case, he repented and God forgave him and he was good. But the problem was there was still going to be a problem with him and everybody else that was around. He had created an issue. And sin breaks relationships, which means sin comes prepackaged with consequence. If you break trust with your spouse and you go back to your spouse and tell them the truth, your trust going forward is not going to be the same as it was beforehand. Even if you reconcile, even if you get to a place where you feel like you're good, it's never going to be the same. Sin comes prepackaged with its own consequences. You can fill in the blank with any sin. It comes prepackaged with its own consequence. And in David's case, that consequence was going to be calamity brought on him from his own household. At this point, David's life turns into one of an episode of Days of Our Lives or Young and Restless, or which pick your soap opera, telenovela, whatever one you want. It turns into a mess. And these three characters, and we'll put these three names on the screen for a minute. Most of David's drama comes from these three people. Now, again, I'm about to fast forward 15 years of history in just a couple of seconds, so please go back and read this from 2 Samuel, but here's kind of what happens in David's life after Nathan comes and speaks to him. Literally nothing happens for about 10 years, and David gets really comfortable, right? He feels like nothing's going to happen. And then, all of a sudden, his oldest son, Amnon, falls in love with his sister. This is Amnon's sister. He falls in love with his own sister by different mothers. So, same father, different mothers, but they fall in love with each other. And so he falls in love with Tamar. Tamar doesn't even know he exists. Amnon tries to take Tamar for himself. She refuses him. He ends up forcing himself upon her. And at the end of that, it's the most tragic story. He looks at Tamar after he's forced himself upon her, realizes how much he hates her, and casts her out of his house. Now, her big brother, Absalom, didn't take very kindly to that. So Tamar, her life is now over. Her dreams cannot come true. She's not going to get married. She's not going to have a house of her own. She's not going to be able to move forward in society because of what Amnon has done. And so Absalom takes Tamar into his own home. David finds out this happened and he didn't do anything at first. But Absalom waits. And he waits, and another 5 or 6 years pass, and he waits until everybody's forgotten the situation. And one night, Absalom invites his father to come over to his house for dinner. He said, I'm going to bring the whole family over. It's going to be great. We're going to have everybody sitting at the same table. David refuses because he knows what kind of drama has already started in his kids' lives. He says, well, I'm going to be such a burden on you. I'll just stay in the palace. So then Absalom says, well, can I invite my brothers and sisters? Absolutely. Invite all your siblings, knock yourself out. Absalom brings them all in. He sits Amnon at the head of the table. He gets them all really, really drunk. And at the end, when Amnon is super drunk, Absalom sends in his guards and slays his brother in front of the entire family. Right? Again, somebody should make a TV show out of this. He kills his brother in front of the entire family, and everybody freaks out. Absalom runs to Persia, and the brothers and sisters that survived this slaughter run out back to the palace and tell David what has happened. And so Absalom is living in Persia, and then David finds out of all of this, and he does nothing. Again, he does nothing. Why? Well, because David has already realized that his mistake is so public knowledge now. Right? Who am I, David thinks, who am I to tell anybody else how to live their lives when I've made such a mistake? That prepackaged consequence of feeling like, you know what, I don't have any grounds to speak into the life of my children is going to continue to cost him over the next couple decades of his life. Fast forward again, and David starts to miss Absalom. Absalom's been living in the north, hiding from the rest of his family. David sends out someone to go find Absalom and bring him back to Jerusalem. So finally he convinces Absalom to come back, but he refuses to see his son. So Absalom is hiding in Jerusalem, waiting for his dad to call upon his name, and he's not calling on him. So Absalom goes full crazy, burns down somebody's farm to try to get his dad's attention. They finally get him together. David won't speak to his own son because this whole drama has just created such a mess, and David feels such guilt about it. But Absalom is kind of, comes into his presence. David won't say anything. He lays his hands on him, prays a blessing over him. That was supposed to kind of feel like the reconciliation, right? It was like the father's going to, we're good now, and I'm going to forget what you've done in the past, but you and I, we're fine going forward. But the problem is David, there's no record that David ever speaks to Absalom again. So Absalom, I just want to sum this up really fast. He's got a sister whose life is over and a dad who did nothing about it. He murdered his own brother, and his dad did nothing about it. His whole family is a mess, right? His relationship with his wives, plural, again, it was a mess to begin with, but now it's really a mess. And so Absalom is feeling like David's doing nothing over and over and over again, and he finds himself in a place where he goes, I can rule this place better than King David. I can rule this place better than my dad. My dad's a mess. My dad has made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and now it's my turn. And so Absalom cooks up this scheme. He's going to steal the kingdom from his dad. But he's brilliant because he doesn't just march an army into Jerusalem. What Absalom does is he sets up this little table outside the walls of Jerusalem. And every time somebody came into town to try to ask the king's advice, Absalom met them there. And he solved their problems. For like 4 years, he just sits outside the walls. He's like, hey, what can I do for you? And he becomes like the good guy, right? And everybody's loving Absalom and he's stealing their hearts. So then one day, it comes to the conclusion that Absalom now has the entire kingdom under his, like they love him and they want him to be king. And so Absalom is about to march on Jerusalem. So the scripture picks up in 2 Samuel and it says, a messenger told David, the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom. And he's going to march into town, and it's going to be really ugly because they're going to throw us out. So then David said to all the officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately. He will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to sword. Now, at this point, because I fast-forwarded so much, in your mind you might be thinking David was the worst king ever, right? But you don't understand that I fast-forwarded years and years and years of his history, right? This was when David was in his 50s. Years had passed of him being a really great king, right? Years had passed of him being a really great leader until he made this mistake with Bathsheba and then made mistake after mistake after mistake. And no one's ever accused David of being a good dad, but David is still considered to be the greatest king that Israel ever had because of things like this that we gloss over every time we read this story. David knows that Absalom's going to come in, and he knows it's going to be a fight. But David also knows that Absalom's outnumbered, terribly outnumbered. And all David has to do is snap his fingers, and his guards will kill his son, and there'll be a battle, and lots of people will lose their lives, but, David will still be king. David realizes, though, that this will put the city to sword and bring ruin on everyone. And so to save this city from his mistake, David flees. And he takes who's with him, and he runs out of town. And see, here's where we find ourselves. Absalom's angry, and he's hurt, and he's frustrated, and he's bitter, and he feels like everything is not fair. And David, in the back of his mind, is thinking, this isn't how things were supposed to go. Wait, God, you promised, right? Here we are. God, you promised. You promised me. You promised me that this was going to work out differently. You made promises that I was going to be the king, and you made promises that this life was going to go so much better. And you fill in the blank with whatever crisis you find yourself in, but all of a sudden when you realize you're not going to get to walk a daughter down the aisle, or your prodigal son is not going to come home, or you're not going to get that job, you're not going to get into that school, that job's not going to work out the way that you thought, and you're like, where? God, you promised. And we ask questions like, where's God? What's the point of even continuing? My whole future was built on getting this job, and now it's not happening. I don't even know where to go. Why should I even try? Why should I even move forward? David had waited years and years and years to become king. Now, in this case, it was his fault, and he made a choice that cost him dearly. But some of us sitting in this room, we didn't make bad choices. We just didn't get what we thought we were going to get. We didn't feel like God answered the prayer. What we asked for didn't show up. So how are we supposed to react to this? Well, this is often the way that we do. Where's God? What's the point? Why even try? Well, fast forward just a little bit more, and as David is leaving the city, we start to get the answer to perhaps the way we can start to look at these things in our own lives. Here's what happened. The whole countryside, it says, the whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the wilderness. So the king is walking out and bringing his entourage with him, and everybody who's loyal to him is crying because Absalom's on the way, and David's leaving. He's not going to stay and defend the city. It says Zadok was there, and Zadok is the high priest. He was there too, and all the Levites, that's just the tribe of people who were supposed to be, helping the priests. They were with him, and they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that big golden box from Indiana Jones. It was also the box that has the 10 Commandments in it, one of which David has already broken, actually a couple of which David has already broken, to create this debacle that he finds himself in. But that was really viewed to be the presence of God. In fact, an army, it said, that this box marched in front of couldn't be defeated. And God had already proved time and time again when they took the Ark of the Covenant into battle, they won overwhelmingly. And so the Ark of the Covenant is leaving the city with David. And David does something kind of crazy. It says, the king then turned to Zadok and said, take the Ark of God back into the city. And there was, it doesn't say this, but I am certain there was an audible groan from everybody in their entourage. Because that was like the symbol that they were the ones that were the good guys in this situation. Right? Well, we're taking God with us. Absalom can have the city, but God's going with us because we're the ones that are in the right and he's in the wrong. David said, no, take it back into the city. And so everybody groans like, well, wait a minute, that's our protection. That's our presence of God with us. That's showing we're the ones in the right here. How could you do that? And then David says this, if I find favor, I don't know what tomorrow holds. It's so conditional. I don't know what the future looks like. I'm not sure how this is going to go, but look, if I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Why would David say such a thing? Is it because God had been so faithful to him through his entire life? I think it's an incredibly mature thing to see this, because I have been in my own messes and my own crises, some of which were my own creation and some of which had nothing to do with me. But I find myself in those crisis situations. The last thing that seems to come to mind to me is God's faithfulness. And yet in this particular case, David's like, God's God. And if he sees favor to bring me back, that's good. But if not, that's good too. And whatever God decides to do in my life, I'm pleased and I'm okay. But wait a minute, David, your dream's not going to come true. Yeah, but God is bigger than that. But wait a minute, David, God's not going to, this thing that you feel like's promised to you is not going to come. Yeah, but God's bigger than all of that. Yeah, but David, your son is marching into the city and you thought he was going to be king and now it's created this mess. Yeah, but God's bigger than all that. And gosh, it's such a tough pill to swallow. But David seems to be saying in the midst of our crisis, in the midst of our times where we feel like our future's not going to turn out the way we thought, God's bigger than that. In other words, he chose not to abandon God when it appeared that God chose to abandon him. God hadn't abandoned him. In fact, by the end of his story, you start to realize that he had not been abandoned. But he chose not to abandon God when it appeared that he had been abandoned. Now, let's finish the story so I can show you how this all plays out. But I don't want you to miss. David decided, he chose to be faithful, even when everything around him was telling him to jettison his faith. Even when all of the odds seemed to be stacked against him, even when he could not see the horizon for the mess that had surrounded him, even though his entire family was a soap opera and he had no idea what was going to happen next, he chose not to abandon God, even though it appeared at the time that God had abandoned him. So, what happens with Absalom? So Absalom marches into the city. Absalom marches into the city and he takes it without swinging a sword. Not a single person dies, not a single battle happens, but it feels like a hollow victory because Absalom's a bitter kid. And our parents can cause us more pain than anyone else on planet Earth. And he feels like his dad has wronged him, and it's a hollow victory because he didn't get to kill his dad. So Absalom starts this 7-year battle with him and David, and they're fighting each other and hiding from each other, and David's refusing to swing a sword at his son, and he keeps trying to get out of all the battles. Well, finally, after 7 years, it feels like Absalom is it's going to happen. This battle is going to take place. His men are telling David, there's no way we can get out of this. They're going to chase us. They found themselves in the forest, and so finally, they say, David, this battle is going to happen. We're going to have to do something. So David gathers all his generals together, and he puts the whole army in front of him. And he tells them this, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. Wait a minute, this is Absalom who chased you out of your kingdom. He's standing between you and the throne. Yeah, but he's my son. Yeah, but wait a minute, he's the cause of your future not working out the way you thought it would. Yeah, but be gentle with him for my sake. So then the battle took place in this forest of Ephraim. And I don't know why, again, I'm such a nerd, but the way they talk about the forest of Ephraim is it swallows more soldiers than the actual battle does. So to me, it feels like it's one of those terrifying forests from the Lord of the Rings that, I'm not saying there were Ents on the battlefield or anything, but it was crazy, all right? And all of these soldiers are getting swallowed by the trees. But David was smart enough, because he was outnumbered at this point, to fight Absalom's army in the trees, and then the numbers didn't amount to anything. So it says that Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great. 20,000 men. 20,000 men were killed. So they surround Absalom, and David wasn't there. David was still back in the camp, but Joab and some of his other generals surround Absalom, and they kill Absalom right there in front of the entire army, even though David had said to be gentle with his son. So they bring the news back to David that they've won a great victory today, that 20,000 men have been killed, but hey, you've got your kingdom back. All right, you're back on track with where you needed to be. David grieved so much that his men were terrified to celebrate that they'd won. And finally, one of his generals comes up and shakes him. He's like, look, you're acting like we did a bad thing here. We gave you your kingdom back. But David is so grieved and so overwhelmed by what has happened that his dream can't come true, that he doesn't know what he's going to do next. He has no idea what step to take next. So he goes back into his kingdom, and 9 years later, this is the end of his story, but 9 years later, King David dies and hands off the kingdom to someone else. This was not how David dreamed up his story. So how is it that in the middle of all that circumstance, David can continue to write words like he did in Psalms, words like he did here, where he says that in you, God, when we place our faithfulness in you, we are never forsaken. God, when we trust you, you are our hope. You are our steadfast hope. You are our fortress. How can he write words like that when these are the things that he's experienced? Well, because he knows that the foundation of our faith is not answered prayer. As hard as this is for some of us to hear, and as hard as we've prayed for some things, and as hard as we've asked for some things, the foundation of our faith is not actually answered prayer. God's faithfulness towards you is not measured in terms of how often you've got him to do what you've asked him to do. God sees bigger, and he's on a bigger plane, and he's a part of much bigger things that are happening in our lives, and God's faithfulness towards you is not necessarily measured in unanswered prayer or answered prayer or unanswered prayer. It's not about how many times God showed up and gave you your happily ever after ending either. And that's probably the toughest pill for any of us to swallow. But when we take our life and we compare it just a bookend between birth and death, it kind of looks like a tragedy, doesn't it? But David realized that life isn't bookended by birth and death, that we have eternity. We have eternity with God. That through faith, and now for us who are Christians, through Jesus, we have this eternal gift, this eternal promise of eternal life with God. And all of a sudden, those moments where it feels like, God, where were you, may have been, and this is what always happens to me, those moments where it feels like, God, where were you, the situation turns out better than it would have if I'd gotten what I'd asked for. But sometimes it doesn't. The truth is, it's not measured in whether we got the happily ever ending or not. We're mistaken to assume that we've been forsaken. God hasn't abandoned you. As hard as it might be for you to feel right now, and as hard as it may be for you to admit right now, God has not abandoned you. God has not abandoned you. He loves you too much to abandon you. He loves you too much to forsake you. Listen to these words that David said again. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. God, it's you. I don't get this, and I don't understand the situation, and I don't know why what I've asked for is not going to come to pass, but I know that you're bigger than this. I know you're more faithful than this. I know you've been with me in the past, and you've not let me down to this place, and it feels like you're kind of letting me down now, but I know that that's not what's happening, so God, I trust you. Whatever you choose to have happen, let that happen. In other words, not my will, your will. That is a really spiritually mature thing to say. And I'm not guilting any of us who can't say these words out loud yet, but I am saying that David did. And there are people in this room who have over and over and over again. And God has not forgotten that faithfulness, and God has not abandoned or forsaken them, and he's not abandoned or forsaken you. God is so good. He's so good, and it's so hard to see when things are difficult. But he is so good. We're going to sing this last song together to kind of close out this series and close out this message that's kind of difficult for us to hear. And we're singing a song called Give Thanks. And this, no, that was what we opened with. I'm so sorry. We're singing a song here to close this out that's going to help kind of connect all of these messages together, what we've been talking about. And I hope that it kind of becomes an anthem for you as you feel out what God might be calling you to do with the season you find yourself in. So let me pray for you. God, I just want to thank you so much for this story. It's hard. For those of us that find ourselves in a place where our dreams can't come true, it doesn't mean you love us any less. It doesn't mean that you've abandoned us. It doesn't mean that we've been forsaken. It just means that the future is not going to turn out the way we thought. But that doesn't mean you don't have a plan. It doesn't mean you don't have love for us, and it doesn't mean that you haven't left us behind. So God, help us to see that. Help us to trust you in these seasons. We love you. Ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.